Hello, Symposiast. I'm Dr. Angela Puca, Religious Studies PhD, and as you know, this is your online resource for the academic study of magic, esotericism, paganism, shamanism, and all things occult, including the Celts and the Celtic that we will discuss today. But before we dive in with our interview and our special guest, I'd like to remind you that Angela's Symposium is a crowd-funded project. So if you have the means and want to help this project going, I would really appreciate it if you consider supporting my work with a one-off PayPal donation by joining memberships. My Inner Symposium on Patreon, that's a fantastic community, so I also recommend it for that. And you will find all the links in the info box, and in a pinned comment afterwards. Even though I know that YouTube at the moment is going to remove the clickable links from the comments, so rely probably on my bio more from end of August onwards. But yeah, as for now, you will find the links in the info box. And also subscribe to my newsletter. You will find the link in the bio. It should be the first one that appears. That's the way you can be part of my community, regardless of what social media platforms do. And in utter disregard of all the censorship and all the things that you can say or cannot say. So please join my tribe on and sign up to my newsletter. And thank you, Andrew, for moderating the chat. Well, now it's time to bring our special guest on, Dr. Amy Hale. Thank you so much for being here with us. How are
Hey,
you today?
Angela. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. And hello to everyone in the symposium today. It's a beautiful day here in Atlanta, Georgia, and I hope it's beautiful where everybody else is too.
Yeah, I think the first time I came across you was at the American Academy of Religion, because I think you were chairing the Pagan Studies um, unit at the American Academy of Religion. Was that correct? I think it was
That
during
is
the pandemic.
that is correct. I was the co-chair of the Pagan Studies unit for a number of years, and now I'm still technically on the steering committee, and I think for a couple more years yet. But yes,
Mm.
I did
So,
do
would you
that.
mind tell us something about yourself and your, what is that you do, that you are working on? And obviously, thank you so much for being on the show and
Oh
agreeing to
no,
be here.
this is great, and it's good to meet with you and with everybody on your symposium team. So I'm Dr. Amy Hale. I have a PhD in folklore and mythology from UCLA, which is a cool degree, but unfortunately not one that you can get at UCLA anymore. Um, I am currently what is known as an independent researcher. So, although I do have an affiliation coming up that I can't share yet, I'm unaffiliated. I did my doctoral work on Cornwall and contemporary Celtic identities in Cornwall back in the late 90s. I kind of was comparing and contrasting Cornish ethno-nationalism and identity, Cornish identity politics and Cornish identity with people who were coming into Cornwall mostly for spiritual reasons. So, kind of spiritual Celticism. So it's kind of comparing and contrasting the history of those two in Cornwall. Excuse me. And I've been interested in and working around Cornwall and Cornishness since the mid 90s. Sorry, I have a bit of a cold I picked up in Hungary. So I'm
I'm
coughing
sorry
and
about
hacking a
that.
bit. And during that time, I became interested in a surrealist who made and occultist, female occultist, who made her home in Cornwall for 40 years, called Ethel Colquhoun. And so I worked on her material for 20 years. And in 2020, I did a biography of her called Genius of the Fern-Loved Gully, just as the interest in magic and art and women was kind of starting to take off. And so I've written extensively on Colquhoun. I've got a couple of other projects that I'm working on related to Colquhoun right now. I was also the editor of a wonderful volume called Women in Western Esotericism that was out in 2022 with Palgrave. But right now I do a lot of work on art. I do a lot of writing on art. I do a lot of gallery work and commissions, in addition to writing books on magic and art and women in Cornwall in various combinations, as I like to say.
That's very interesting. And people should really follow your Instagram and your work. You will find all the links and contact details in the info box as well. And so the first question, let's crack on. And what do you think is or are the biggest misconceptions about the Celts and the Celtic culture? Because it's something that is it's a hot topic among pagans. It seems like pagans tend to gravitate a lot towards Celtic spirituality and Celtic paganism. So what do you think are the biggest misconceptions about the Celts and the Celtic?
Well, I can kind of share some of what happened in my own experience there in terms of understanding and unpacking what Celtic means. Because when I was a teenager back in the 80s, I loved all things Celtic. And we didn't really have a lot of the material, a lot of the popular books on Celticism and Celtic magic that you can find today. But what there were a lot of reprints of people who were reprinting kind of cheap 19th century folklore about the Celts, about Arthurian legend, and this idea of this kind of mystical Celtic culture that went all the way in the back and was, that was there from time immemorial. And this idea that, of course, I was also really into, at the time, The Mists of Avalon, which was a really, really important book for a lot of people in the 80s. But it also had this particular, it was drawing on a lot of particularly popular ideas about the Celts and, romantic ideas about Celtic religion and Celtic spirituality. And so when I went to college, I wanted to find out what the roots of the Celts were, because I had this feeling that they came from the dawn of time, and that there was clearly some really important magic that was there if you could only find what the roots of the Celts were. And I kind of went on this journey of trying to study that. And when I was an undergraduate, I started really looking at the archaeological history in particular, and also some of the politics and history surrounding how the term Celtic was used. And I realized, and it was this moment of crisis for me, I realized that the story that we had been told about the Celts being this coherent, monolithic culture that was in some way consistent across Europe back into the Bronze Age, that was not true. In fact, that it was diverse, it was fragmented, and in fact, there was some kind of disagreement about how the term Celtic could even be used accurately historically. Does it refer to a family of languages? Does it refer to distinctive material culture, or some sort of blending of them? I think that there's a lot of what we see today that is branded as Celtic magic or Celtic spirituality that is drawing from much older conceptions of what Celtic means, drawing on, again, 19th century folklore texts that might have been ideologically driven in one way or another. The idea that we know what the Celts did, what they believed, what they practiced, we really don't know. And so there's a lot of creative invention that comes into a lot of these books, which are sometimes, frequently, not using the best, most up-to-date understanding of how the term Celtic is used in various historical contexts. But I just want to make it really clear, that material and those conversations among scholars are really not easily acceptable, or not acceptable. They're not accessible to most people.
I'm sure that some people may find that unacceptable as well.
Yes, that was
because
probably a Freudian
it can
slip.
ruin a mystified.
Because it's true that a lot of people would also not find them acceptable. But they're not readily accessible to a lot of people for probably reasons that you've discussed about, the difficulty of academia making material public and accessible. So a lot of these conversations about how we understand historically the word Celtic and the complexities there, it's kind of there. People don't know where to go. I think it's certainly better now, but it's still not easy. So I don't blame anybody for getting a bunch of bad information, because when I was 16, I had a bunch of bad information, and frankly, the bad information is really sexy. It's really interesting. It's really deeply, deeply compelling. It tells a very deeply compelling story. So I think that's one of the places that I would start. That in terms of misconceptions, that Celtic is monolithic, that we know, or that we understand a lot about what would be considered ancient practices. Also, a thing that I would want to stress to people, maybe before even going into the how the variations of how the term Celtic is used, is that a lot of what people look at as Celtic myth is medieval stories that were written down in a Christian context. And sometimes we can do the work and say, well, maybe those were deities, maybe that hints at practice, but we don't know for sure, because we don't have written records of what was happening in pre-Christian areas, Celtic areas. We don't know for sure. So I think that there's a lot of guesswork that happens, and I think there are a lot of people who look at that medieval material and want to project backwards in this way, that where they're seeming very certain about it. But in fact, we don't know. Like, we don't know who a lot of those figures are. We don't know how, if they were deities, how they would have been worshipped. And so I caution people when they're looking at that material to understand the historical context in which those were originally written, and then the contexts later on in which Celtic mythology and Celtic medieval tales were written about, particularly in the 18th and 19th and early 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about the Celts? Since people in the chat like Ray are bringing that up.
So what about the term Celtic?
I was thinking about the Celtic people, the Celts.
So in a modern sense, the Celts, and I've seen that somebody else had said something about the Gauls and the Gaulish. So the degree to which those terms are interchangeable, there are a lot of what we consider Celtic tribal names. The contemporary Celts, the modern Celts, are considered to be in Scotland, Ireland, Isle of Man, Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, Galicia. And then, of course, there are a number of people on the European continent who feel or express that they've got some sort of Celtic identity, maybe based in language, maybe based in material culture, maybe based in a whole bunch of other things. Those are really what are considered to be the modern Celtic nations. And the term Celtic as an ethnonym is actually, in a lot of ways, a very modern term. Back in the day, the degree to which, people in the Iron Age would have been calling themselves Celts in any unified sense. We know the term came from the Greek keltoi, which was a term of othering at the time to some degree or another. And a lot of these terms have kind of this, and certainly today, have this sense of othering kind of within it. So people weren't universally calling themselves Celts really until we start getting the explorations into Celtic language and language studies in the 17th century, mostly 17th and early 18th century, when people were trying to classify everything. The kind of earliest sciences were were emerging, where people wanted to kind of put everything in boxes and create family trees. And so the earliest linguistic studies were of Celtic languages kind of helped to create this category of Celtic. And so today, scholars, like strict scholars in Celtic studies, will say that Celt and Celtic only refers to a family of languages. But the problem is, when that term was kind of initiated to describe this linguistic group, it had connotations of race and culture as well. So it wasn't just that a person might have spoken Irish or Welsh. It was that they were also maybe had certain racial characteristics, because that was language and understanding that was common at the time. So people were there were these entire categories where today we disambiguate those terms. We understand that, just because you speak a particular language doesn't mean that you have any kind of cultural inheritance or any kind of behavioral proclivities. But as the term Celtic developed, certain things were associated with being Celtic. And a lot of those come out of, and this is really important, a colonial context, because all of those areas that I had mentioned were colonized. They were colonized by the English, by the French, by other people. And so you get this ethnonym, which is essentially modern, that is describing these conditions, these conditions of disparity, of colonialism, and the way that Celts were characterized. And you certainly see this really strongly in the 19th century, tended to be as people who couldn't take care of themselves, because they were always portrayed in a lot of ethnographic writing as a little bit backward and spiritual, more close to the earth, more close to nature. A lot of these concepts, which were also very, at the time, feminized. So you kind of have these peoples who were being described this way, often as a justification for colonial activity. Well, they can't take care of themselves, so somebody's got to step in and kind of help them to rule their own countries. But from this, you end up getting these characteristics that get associated with Celtic peoples. And this is why when you talk about Celtic ethnic identity, historically, you are always talking about the development of ideas of spiritual concepts, particularly in Britain and the places that were colonized by Britain early, such as, obviously Ireland, Wales. These concepts grow together historically as we're understanding the modern use of the term Celtic, because these peoples who spoke these particular languages were seen to have particular spiritual capabilities. And those end up being developed, and we end up getting this idea of Celtic spirituality, a distinctive, frequently nativist Celtic spirituality that develops out of the use of that term. I know that's kind of complicated. Did that make sense? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking that it actually reminds me of a pattern that I've seen with other types of traditions as well, like for instance with the Native Americans.
Yes.
So they start to be seen as, the backwardly savage, not civilized, and then end up being seen as the epitome of spirituality, because they are somewhat closer to nature. So I find it interesting how you see this pattern quite frequently. So while you were explaining this very interesting facet, I was just going through my mind. It's like, oh, I can see this pattern happening with other traditions as well. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, why do people that are initially seen as backwardly and uncivilized, how do they move from being heroes of spiritual awakening and spirituality?
Yeah. So you're asking, like, why does that happen?
Yeah.
Well, I think that a lot of it happens in the particular distinction between that which is considered rational and that which is considered irrational.
Oh, yeah. It's
So,
a glorification of the irrational in a way.
oh, absolutely. And we see a lot of this really emerging, obviously, with the rise of the Romantic movement and with Romantic nationalism, where a lot of these categories end up being reified as something which has substance in a very essentialist way. We can also look at how women were considered as more spiritual beings. Women are more spiritual, therefore they can channel more easily. They're dreamier. Women are closer to nature. All of these categories have this kind of binary, this binary opposition to them. And so you get all of these colonized groups in kind of a lump that end up being treated the same way and given the same set of virtues. And a lot of it has to do with discourses of rationality and irrationality. So there are some groups that have it, and it's cool for them to be on top of the pile, right? Like your white Anglo-Saxon man who gets to do the ruling because they clearly have the rationality. And it kind of sounds almost a lot of that is baked into the assumptions of how power structures work today. I mean, we know that. But if you look particularly at the writings of Matthew Arnold, who wrote on Celtic literatures in the 19th century, he was a British scholar who was really credited with popularizing and valorizing the Celts as, kind of the literary genius of the Welsh and the Irish. But if you read Matthew Arnold's On Celtic Literature, the weird, kind of awful, explicit, racist stuff in there about the Celtic mind and the Anglo-Saxon mind, it's shocking, because we don't normally talk about things in terms like that today. But if we're really wanting to understand the roots of how Celtic peoples get seen in the way that they do, seeing that kind of writing and how it emerged as people from particularly the English center were understanding these areas as colonized areas and as areas that were socially and culturally inferior, I think it puts the term Celtic in a very different context. And that's kind of the root of my own approach to it. When, I see the term Celtic primarily as something which comes out of a past having to do with colonization. I see it as a social justice term. I see it as basically something that the biggest shared experience of Celtic peoples is not so much in their this idea of a spiritualized past. It's really in a shared condition of structural inequality.
Can you elaborate more on the latter part, on the structure and politics?
Sure. Well, all of the areas that are considered, among the modern Celtic nations today were subject to colonization. They were the people who spoke Celtic languages and who still speak them today were considered to be of a lower class. The languages themselves were, I don't know the word I'm looking for. They attempted to eradicate them, which is why we have Celtic language revivals today, because those areas were eradicated in terms of like local language use. So these areas also tended to be more poor. They were not areas that had a lot of economic development. And these are features that still exist in Celtic speaking areas today. My field site, Cornwall, has consistently been one of the poorest regions of Europe ever since mining declined in the 19th century. It used to be very wealthy. It used to be a very wealthy part of Britain. But Cornwall today has not been well served in terms of economic development, because people tend to see Cornwall as part of this romantic Celtic periphery that, it's really beautiful. Maybe it's okay if we keep it a little bit backward, maybe not develop it in the way that we can, because it ends up being a tourist playground for rich people rather than a place that has any kind of sustained development in it, which is another thing that you tend to see in Celtic areas. The economic development pattern in many of those areas, not all, it's very spotty, but it has, they kind of suffer from a sense of romantic, I don't know, it's more, they're seen as areas that are kind of filled more with romantic beauty than and authentic culture, rather than places that are filled with modern contemporary people who want to live modern contemporary lives. And that's the view from the center, rather than what is typically called the Celtic periphery. So yeah, I'm interested in terms of looking at it as a social justice term, in terms of economic development, and what are the things that really connect the Celtic peoples together today. And it's not so much that they have a similar culture, because each Celtic nation is very different. They've had different histories, they have different cultures, different traditions, different values. And so there's a lot of diversity in the Celtic world. I think there's also this tendency to try to, especially when looking at the medieval literature, to try to have these kind of overarching pantheons and overarching Celtic themes. But each Celtic nation, each Celtic people is different, and even within Celtic areas there are distinctions. And I think it's important to remember that there's this variety and this diversity, but one thing that absolutely links them is a history of colonization.
Yeah, absolutely. And Andrew was saying, where there is a lack of historical evidence, there is a need to mythologize, which is very useful and necessary.
Well, yeah, I think that it depends on what you mean by useful and necessary. I think it's useful and necessary in the sense that mythologizing in that way can certainly be a way to bring people together and to inspire people. But when the mythologizing actually supplants the historical truths, I think then maybe we want to reconsider how that is done. And, what I think the question is, what is the context for the mythologization?
Yeah, and I guess it also depends on whether the mythologization is meant to supplant history or whether it's meant to be a mythology. So I think the problem only arises when mythology is presented as history, whereas when mythology is presented as mythology, then I think that it is something that's quite poetic and can be a way of meaning making for people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you want to look at, and this is just completely, sort of jumping to another topic, yet not totally unrelated, but if you want to look at the way that a lot of pagans today, or particularly Wiccans or eclectic Wiccans, might look at what they would consider to be an origin myth, and how you would talk about that in inspirational terms while still trying to understand the actual histories of those traditions and how they develop, particularly in the 20th century. I think that there are things that can suitably inspire in an imaginal way, but again, when it supplants our actual understanding of history and what we need to know about history in order to get people where they want to be in terms of self-determination, because I think that's something else that's really important in looking at how Celtic peoples see themselves today. Self-determination is really important. And, if we're clouding that, in any way by mythologizing efforts, then maybe it's not as helpful.
Yeah, it can become a problem. So to summarize then, what do we really know about the Celts and Celtic spirituality, if anything? Because you said we know that there's a lack of historical evidence, but I want to know, based on your research, is there anything conclusive, historically speaking, about what the Celts were doing and what Celtic people were practicing in terms of their religion and spirituality?
So it's really interesting the way that you phrase that, and it's not an uncommon phrasing of that
I know
question.
it's monolithic, and I wanted to raise that.
No.
That's why I phrased my question in that way, because it's the way people would phrase it, probably.
The thing that's interesting about it is that when people talk about Celtic spirituality, or what did the Celts do, it automatically situates that term in the past in a pre-Christian context.
Okay.
So the idea that the Celts were perhaps most authentically ancient, pre-Christian, it's like, well, so what is Celtic spirituality? A lot of people in Cornwall and Wales would say, well, we're Methodist, or we're Anglican, or in Ireland, we're Catholic, or actually in Cornwall could also be we're Buddhist, or we're pagan. So there's this situating of the term Celtic in this kind of weird, romantic, pre-Christian miasma that, again, we don't know anything about. But I think it's also important to ask, to what degree is that relevant to the contemporary spiritualities of people who identify as Celts today? And just keep in mind, when we're looking at that and we're asking questions about supposed continuity and ideas of authenticity, where do we historically locate the Celts? And most people want to locate them in this pre-Christian pagan past.
As early as possibly can. That's why.
Right. And a lot of our ideas about that and about what the Druids did were actually came out of early Anglicans and Unitarians in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, excuse me, who were writing about Druids kind of in this way, trying to mirror their own time and politics and ideas about spirituality, where either the Druids were the super goodies or the super baddies, or the proto-patriarchs. Yeah, that's kind of one of my favorites, was the ancient Druids. They were actually just Christians without the Christ, because they didn't really know about Christ yet until he came to Britain. And then the Druids, that's how they end up being the patriarchs. So there are all of these really, the Druids are this really great kind of foil for whatever is going on historically. Excuse me. But what do we know about what they actually did? Not much. We can say that they probably pretty certainly did divination through sacrifice, mostly probably through animal sacrifice. They probably did a lot of entrail readings. We know that. We can also probably suppose, with some level of certainty, that they had oracular traditions, and certainly we know this to be the case in the medieval period in Wales particularly, but also in Ireland, that satire, that poetry, ideas of sacred speech in particular, were seen as oracular, and that they were very important, and they continued to be important for some time. These are things that we can probably safely assume. We can probably also safely assume that they had deities, that they had localized deities, We don't know what the nature of them necessarily was. We don't know if there was a big pantheon, or more than likely they were localized, very localized, or maybe a combination of both, as we find elsewhere, like in Greece and Rome. Gosh, I'm so sorry, folks.
No problem.
So these are things that are probably pretty decent guesses. They probably had ideas of we know that there are ritual deposits. So in like people would throw their stuff into lakes and bogs and streams. We can probably assume that from that they believed that, and this is something that is I heard an archaeologist talk about recently that I think was really cool. They may very well have believed that their most precious items had some sort of animistic force to them, or that they related to them as beings in their own right. So these are just some bits and pieces of things that we can look at from and I'm really careful when I talk about the medieval literature and trying to draw ritual or practice out of it, because I think that it's so many hundreds of years later and in such a different context that I feel really uncomfortable in making some of those generalizations. But I think there are some things that we can say, yeah, probably these are probably some things. I think knowing that the poetic tradition was so important, and knowing how important words were, and putting words together in the right way, and the power that they had. We know this from certainly the medieval traditions in Ireland and Wales. But, what happened in Cornwall, what happened in Brittany, where we don't have quite the amount of medieval literature that we do in these areas? What happened in Scotland? What happened in the parts of England where they spoke Celtic languages until relatively late? We don't necessarily know. We don't really know. So there's, again, a lot of guesswork that goes into it.
Yeah. And also, I think I was also thinking that asking what is Celtic spirituality and what did the Celts do is also assuming that it is one monolithic population or one monolithic culture. And as we said earlier, that's not the case. And that's one of the misconceptions about Celtic people and Celtic spirituality, that it's not something monolithic.
Yeah, I also I like to give this analogy that if I speak French, that would not make me French. I would be an American who spoke
like
French.
I'm not English, for instance.
Right? You're not.
You have an example right here.
Right. And if just because somebody in Mexico speaks Spanish, that does not mean that they are from Spain. So, but we tend to forget that we don't tend to think about the realities of the way that language and material culture move. So like if you look at, say, the Latin culture, which is one of the earliest, like Latin and Hallstatt are kind of known as being the earliest kind of identifiable Celtic forms of material culture and design. Excuse me. You can look at how those spread. And I'm not up on the archaeology there. For a while, it was being thought that those were elite cultures, that, elite cultural forms that moved through. And people want to make these huge generalizations about what it means to have something that has that design. People really want to, oh, well, there's kind of proto knotwork in there, so that knotwork must be deities or a special language. I'm like, no. If I'm in China and I find a Coke can, what exactly does that mean? We can say a lot of things about what that can mean, but we can also, there's a lot of stuff that it doesn't mean. And I like to take the approach that just because a thing is in a place, and just because there are a whole bunch of things maybe in that place, doesn't necessarily mean that it's got any particular spiritual significance to it. It might, but it also might not. So yeah, sometimes I see the most wild things, like the whole idea, like where people are, and I've seen this quite a bit, where people are trying to turn Celtic knotwork into this like crazy magical language, and it's just, and attribute deities to it. I'm like, well, that's super interesting. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. That's cool if that's a thing that works for you. I'm just saying, know that there's probably not any historical evidence that that was a thing.
Yeah, that's something that I often tell my audience as well, because I think that academic scholarship proves over and over, especially in the realm of paganism, but more generally, probably, that things that people believe to be historical are not actually historical. I recently made a video and a lecture for my patients on Robert Graves and the concepts of the triple goddess, and that's also something that a lot of people in the pagan community or magic practitioners are not really aware that it is a very modern
Yeah.
construct and it's not historical. So I think that it's important also to highlight, and this is something that I do over and over with my audience, is that and the same goes for perennialism, which is very popular among practitioners. The idea
Oh yeah.
that everything, all the differences in cultures, underlie one truth that is independent of the history and independent of the culture. This is something that for a lot of practitioners believe, and a lot of pagans also believe. And if it works for you in your spiritual practice, I could say I really cannot say anything about it. I mean,
Right.
if it works for you, it works for you. Spirituality and religion are about meaning making, and I think that it's part of your path. The problem starts when people want to claim that what works for them spiritually and religiously is the truth and
Yeah.
a historical fact. And this runs into many problems, both in terms of the, becoming delusional about what actually happened, but also politically, because I feel that when people want to claim that what works for them, for their religiosity and their spirituality, is the truth, is the historical fact, then it becomes the truth in a
Mhm.
metaphysical and in a physical sense, where those who do not follow that are in the wrong and need to be converted, or there are also worst case scenarios with that, following that logic. So I think that it's important to maintain a difference, and it's not necessary that what works for you and what you believe is backed by history, but it's important that you acknowledge the difference, to acknowledge the fact that if you have a vision and Athena appears to you and says, I and Isis are one, and that works for you, and then you start using that on your altar and your rituals, and it works for your spiritual path, that's fantastic. But that, don't go on and claim that Isis and Athena are the same deity, because that is not historically correct. So I think the
Right.
problem really only starts when people tend to conflate things, and a part of it, I think, is because people want validation and is a seek for validation. But that is something that I think the community of practitioners should work on, that validation is not something that should be sought after that way, by manipulating history.
Yeah, I was actually gonna bring this up, that, and this kind of moves into, I think, why one reason why we're seeing kind of maybe another uptick in interest in Celtic things. First of all, this idea of legitimation and also authority, like um, when you're pagan, or involved in magical religions or magical practice, the idea of authority and legitimacy is very much, I think, wrapped up for people in, are they doing it right? Do they have the right to do it? And is it going to work? And so for a lot of people, this idea of lineage, either within a group or just the idea of cultural lineage, something that makes them feel like they have the support in their practice is it's an important question to ask. So it's okay. So where do you see the authority in your practice coming from? Is the authority coming from the idea that Celts 2,000 years ago did this, and so that makes it okay? Or is it it's the authority comes from your own experience, or from being able to build on something, or does the authority come from whoever the perhaps founder of your particular path is, and this ends up getting wrapped up in these ideas of how do we, if we're asking questions about what is the authority and power behind somebody's practice, then this idea of looking at supposed Celtic continuity can really be challenging for people if for them the power and authority is in that form of continuity. And I think for a lot of people today, certainly in the United States, where there are concerns and issues about appropriation and who gets to do what, that for a lot of white people in the United States who may have family backgrounds in areas that are Celtic, it feels to them safe. I think it feels for them like it's an appropriate thing that they can be doing, because they feel, well, at least I'm on safe grounds with doing this thing that maybe my family might have had some roots in. But, then we actually also can start asking questions, uncomfortable questions about appropriation there too. Just because my family was from Scotland at some point in its past, I'm not Scottish, I'm American. I don't have the lived experience of somebody who is in Scotland. So on what grounds do I get to claim that as something that is authentically mine? And I think that's a real question to ask. And for people who are interested in matters of Celtic spirituality, I always ask them to engage with contemporary peoples who are living there, understand the modern history, understand the modern struggles and challenges that people in those areas are facing, and understand that you may not have a right to that material in the way that you think that you do, which a lot of people, that's painful for them to hear, because then they don't know where to go, right?
I find that this is something that is specific to America in my view. I find that Americans and North Americans tend to have this idea that their DNA is their culture, and I find it interesting. But yeah, because I don't see how you can equate DNA with culture. Culture, by definition, is something that you live and breathe. So
But people don't know that. Like over here, and I think in a lot of places, people don't know that. People are still using an old model that our
19th
culture
century
is
model,
carried in our blood. They still
which
use
is
that
very
model. They still
dangerous
believe
and
it.
was used by certain politicians that didn't do very nice things in history.
No, it's absolutely true, but it's a very popular notion. I wrote this rant essay that I've never published anywhere, but maybe I will release it at some point. But it was about a commercial over here for one of those genealogy companies. And I don't know if those are getting popular over in Britain, but it was one of these genealogy companies, and they had this. It was for Father's Day, and they were trying to sell this genealogy package for Father's Day. And there was this image of a dad who was a really good dancer and one who was a really good storyteller, and the ad said, "Wow, is he a really good storyteller because he came from South America? And I was like, whoa, okay, now that's a problem. And we're still selling that model, and people love it. People really find meaning in that, even though, folklorists and anthropologists know, no, that's not how culture works. Culture works in all these other ways. It's transmitted. But people really, really, really want to believe that this stuff is part of their genetic inheritance. And I feel like it's on us as anthropologists and folklorists to publicly engage with these ideas and say, no, that's not right. And it's a problem.
In what ways do you think that it's problematic?
Well, I think it's problematic because, well, first of all, as we were saying, it doesn't work that way. Culture is something that is always alive. It's always transmitted. It is always changing. Do you get it from your family? Yes, but you also get it from everything that's around you. And I think that it essentializes culture in a way that is exclusionary and not helpful. And as you were alluding to, politicians who try to play that card of essentialist culture, that level, that kind of exclusion, tends to take people down a blood and soil road that I personally don't want to go down.
Yeah, I agree. But as I said, I find that this is a view that is particularly prevalent in my experience. It's particularly prevalent in the US and in North America. So I wonder if it is because it's a new country and people feel like they don't have roots there, and because the people that were there were people that have been colonized. So I wonder whether there is a sense of reconnecting with your heritage and not see yourself just as, somebody in somebody's land. So in a
Yeah.
way, I can see that also in a positive way in that sense. But at the same time, it's still important, I think, to acknowledge that culture is not in your genes.
I think maybe if we had different ways of being okay with and looking at our relation to culture and transmission and hybridity and change, that maybe we would feel a little bit less angsty about this idea that we have no heritage, because it's certainly not true. And we're not that new a country. We've been around for, good, we've had, there have been people on this continent for forever. And it's what does it mean by we're a new country in terms of the political experiment? We're a few hundred years old. And white colonial settlers did terrible things that we do have to reckon with, and that some of us anyway are working at reckoning with. But I think if we maybe tried to look at, in the States, like you've got ideas of regional culture, which I think are a lot more accessible for people. So, I'm from the Midwest, I'm from the South, I'm from the Northeast, I'm from New England. I think those are aspects of culture in the US that are very, very tangible, rather than this idea of a national culture, or ideas of heritage, where people tend to feel lost and unrooted. And I wish that we could do something to change that narrative so that people were not feeling that way, because I don't think that really great impulses come from that. And I wish that we could find some sort of healing around that for people.
Yeah. Yeah, I can totally see that. But going back to the topic so that we don't
Yes,
go
we've
astray too much.
kind of flown off the Celtic track here.
Yeah, but it's a topic that interests me as well. So I kind of have to refrain myself going down that rabbit hole because I would have so many things to say on that. Probably for another episode.
Well, it's
But
I just want to kind of break in and say it's difficult because all the stuff that we've just been talking about are part of the context in which we understand the term, in which popular understandings of things that are Celtic arise, both politically and spiritually. So the questions that we've just been talking about, uh, people go to Celtic for their answers, and they create things that are Celtic from those questions. So it's not like it's not relevant. It's just the stuff we're talking about is kind of the soup in which Celtic and issues of Celticity often sits.
mm. And why do you think Celtic spirituality became so popular among pagans and magic practitioners? You mentioned already that it is linked to colonialism and is linked to seeing the Celtic people, first of all, as a monolith, and they are not because it's more of a linguistic family, and the people were actually pretty different from each other, and we don't know much about what they were actually doing. And the fact that they've become associated with the idea of being nature worshipping, linked to nature, and particularly having this particular proclivity is linked to the fact to the binary, the dichotomy between rational and irrational. So they were being seen as the irrational people, and then there was a romanticization of that, saying, okay, they are the irrational, but they are the haven where we should go to reconnect with nature because we have lost that. So there's this interesting dichotomy the where people that had the most power, they would see themselves as the rational people, but at the same time there was the each, to scratch towards the irrational, the spiritual, and when they had to go there, they would go to the other, to the people that were being seen as irrational. Now that we have clarified that, and as I mentioned earlier, I think that this has happened, and it's probably a pattern that happens with a few different cultures that have been colonized, and then they become the pinnacle of spirituality because of that dichotomy that creates. But I was wondering why Celticism particularly has become so popular among pagans. Why do you think that is?
Well, first, I'd like to congratulate you on an excellent summary of my argument. Well done. Uh,
Thank you.
I think that the idea of Celtic spirituality and how it kind of gets into contemporary paganism, in my opinion, is very tied up with a lot of the countercultural nativist spirituality that you start getting in Britain in the late 19th century. So, I mean, the Druids, of course, were kind of much earlier than that, uh, kind of seen as this really wonderful proto, like all British way of how do I describe this? There's like it was that back in the 18th century, the Druids were kind of the great unifiers, right, of British history, and the Celtic substrate was the thing that tied everybody together. And what is more Celtic than a Druid in a stone circle? And those are things that, all British people can relate to because we're all Britons at heart, right? So that means that we all have a Celtic inheritance. So the Druid was kind of emblematic of these ideas about ancient British Celtic spirituality, that all these things were kind of projected onto the Druid in the early modern period anyway. But so that was there, that was very much floating around the antiquarian and folklore sphere. But then in the 19th century in particular, if we're talking about excuse me, the developments of contemporary paganism, you start getting this nativist pushback on theosophy in particular. And you get people like Lewis Spence, who's, I think, one of the founders of SNP. Really, really interesting character. I feel like not enough has been written about Lewis Spence. But Lewis Spence wrote this whole tract about the Druids as being this, why are we doing all of this other Indian stuff? Why are we doing this is not native British stuff. The Druids, this is what we need to go back to. And drawing on things, drawing on the text of Iolo Morganwg and Edward Williams, who was a very, very important in the Welsh language movement, one of the founders of the Gorsedd, and drawing on some of those texts, which were forged. Let's say it. Forged isn't the right word. Creative. I like to think that Iolo Morganwg's material was creative, but which really inspired contemporary Druidry. So, and people didn't know that he was kind of, embellishing his ideas of ancient Druidic ritual. He kind of gave a number of texts that people could run with. So folks like Lewis Spence and others were like, wait, why aren't we using this stuff? Why aren't we doing these native things instead, drawn from ancient Celtic traditions? And then as you start getting into the 20th century, as you start getting into the counterculture, gosh, just kind of want to hop back into 19th century folklore, where people were also trying to project things onto King Arthur and trying to create this idea of an ancient Celtic pantheon. And again, doing all of this reading into Celtic mythology. So during this period, we're kind of getting like all of the ways in which in the 1960s and 70s, British pagans are able to, and American pagans are actually able to draw on these sources for things that they can use in trying to rebuild a paganism that they believe is actually ancient and Celtic. So you're kind of getting the tools and the ideas from the late 19th century. And so, you've got Arthur as solar god, you've got the Druid as the kind of archetypal pre-Christian Celtic priest. And hey, maybe, all the figures in the Mabinogi were actually deities. And, maybe we should, figure out how to work those into practice. And so you start getting people who want to actually reach back and have a pre-Christian Celtic experience. And so they're drawing on these kind of often creatively inspired texts from the 19th century to create this and to kind of hop over a lot of Britain's Christian past. And so I think a lot of it comes out of a nativist enterprise and the idea that we're doing something that is authentically Celtic in Britain, where we have that inheritance. I think that that's where it comes from. Obviously, it's a much more complex story than that, because there are a whole bunch of strands of how that happens and how that comes through. But, kind of as you alluded to, the relationship between that and particularly ideas of sacred landscape, which is another thing that we don't maybe have a whole bunch of time to go into, but it's really foundational to how people perceived ideas of Celtic spirituality and still is. I think that for a lot of British people for whom that is very much part of their lived experience, that it has a different resonance today than it does for particularly American pagans, North American pagans, who are more inspired by ideas of cultural inheritance and heritage. Excuse me. It's kind of a short version because there are so many strands that come together to create this interest in Celtic paganism and why that happens.
That's an interesting take, and I see that happening in Italy as well. The fact that pagans and among pagan communities, there's the so I would say that, for instance, in the Italian landscape, you have that the gateway to paganism was Wicca, because Wicca was very eclectic, and especially the Wicca that came to Italy is the one that was developed in the US rather than the one that came from Britain for some reason, which is interesting because Britain is much closer geographically. But the type of paganism that developed in Italy was much more inspired by the American Wicca. And that's kind of the gateway for pagans. And then they tend to go into, some of them at least, want to discover their heritage, their roots. And so you find that in southern Italy, you have Hellenistic reconstructivists. In the Midlands, you have the Roman reconstructivists. And in northern Italy, you have Celtic spirituality and Celtic festivals and Celtic a lot of things. That's my best friend, in fact, who lives in northern Italy, well, sort of Midlands bordering to northern Italy in Tuscany. And he often mentions the Celtic festival, where it's kind of an esoteric fair in a way, but it's called Celtic Festival. And it's something that is much more prevalent in northern Italy compared to southern Italy, for instance, or the Midlands. So, yeah, I think that it seems to be the case that in pagan communities there is this search for your own pagan heritage, like what was here before the Christians, or what was here that was not Christian, that I can reconnect with. So I think that I see that tendency in Italy as well.
Yeah, I understand that there are a number of people in northern Italy who feel very much attached to ideas of Celtic history and heritage. Is that
Yeah.
that's correct?
Yeah, and also you have the Obod in Italy that is also located in the north, and there
All
are
right.
other Druidic communities in Italy. They are all in the north.
Right. Oh, that's
So
interesting.
yeah, it seems like that it's not like pagan more generally, like eclectic pagans and eclectic Wiccans tend to see the fascination with Celtic spirituality, but more generally, as something that is, oh, this is going to give me a hint of what connection with nature looks like, and it can help me with that. So similar to the appeal that Native American spirituality now has. Perhaps 10 years ago, it was more the Celtic that were having that kind of role, more generally speaking, in the practicing communities. But yeah, definitely in Italy, I can see that the North tends to see the Celtic spirituality as something more linked to their heritage.
I think another facet are publications, again, not just from the 19th century, but also well into the 20th century, suggesting that the Celts had either a matriarchal system, which is absolutely not true.
Yeah,
But
I have a video on that, on the idea of the primordial mother goddess
oh
and how
yeah,
that was created and really sort of helped the development of paganism, but that is not historically true. Sorry, go on.
no, and it's hard too, because I think it's an important. I think the divine feminine is a really really important concept, and it's kind of like we're saying, you know, just because we don't have any evidence for it historically, that particular story, does that mean that there's not some other sense of truth there that is useful or interesting that we can discover and work with? But the idea that the Celts had a significant divine feminine or a mother goddess, or were goddess worshiping in some way, uh, that I think also those texts played a real part in the development of eclectic paganism in particular, as it was intersecting with political feminism. And also, the way that these ideas about the Celts as being nature worshiping, worshiping in groves. Wow, we haven't even talked about James Fraser. Well, let's not. But the idea that Celts and Druids were worshiping among the trees, or that maybe they did worship trees, also intersected with the environmental movement in the 60s and 70s, both in the US and also in the UK. So it was very, very fertile. But Celtic spirituality doesn't just relate to paganism, particularly in Britain. You've got huge intersections with Catholicism and with Anglicanism, particularly High Anglicanism, that has that may use saints, may be interested in saints, may be interested in pilgrimages. Celtic spirituality, in quote marks, in Britain is just as likely to be Christian flavored as it is pagan flavored.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think in Italy it tends to be more linked to paganism, but makes sense that it would be like
it's kind of in Britain it is, and Glastonbury is a great place to look at this phenomenon and so many others, where you see this kind of this intersection of paganism and kind of Celtic paganism and Celtic spirituality, and the way that those stories and narratives kind of converge and have really fuzzy borders, where you have Christians who are kind of reaching out to this idea of a Celtic cultural substrate in Britain, but also drawing off of a lot of Irish texts, off of early modern Scottish texts, Carmina Gadelica, drawing on those spiritually to actually just include more divine feminine, more reverence for the earth, more environmental concerns, just bringing these into Christianity, into their Christianity, but using this idea of Celticity in order to drive those values. And also specific practices like visiting holy wells and doing other saints' pilgrimages. And it's Celtic spirituality, that the Christian side is something. It's another huge phenomenon.
Yeah, and for those in the chat, they are talking about Caesar and what Caesar wrote about the Celts. Guys, Caesar is not a reliable narrator. Caesar was a politician. And I'm telling you that as an Italian who grew up studying Latin and translating the Bello Gallico, which is the book that you're referring to from Caesar, Caesar is not a reliable narrator. He was a good politician. He was not a historian. Let's
that's a really good point. And I mean, we've got ancient sources, and Posidonius and others that people look to try to find potential nuggets about Druidry or what Celts did. And it's just, again, I would say try to read these things with a critical eye, because it's not necessarily that Caesar was completely false in what he said, but as you said, he's not a reliable narrator because systematic history wasn't a thing. People were even the people who were historians were not writing systematic empirical history.
I guess like Pliny is much better, for instance, in terms of the way he would do history. But as you said, as you're saying, the way we understand history now and systematic history is not something that was really a thing at the time. So
it wasn't. And and trying to pull together these threads of what ancient Celts might have done, it's not like we don't have any data at all, but we have to ask questions of the data that we have. We have to look at the context in which things were written, and sometimes it's just kind of it's almost like, for me, honestly, sometimes it's just intuition. It's like, well, would that have been true? Why would somebody have said that? Does that seem like that would have been right? Are there other writers who would have independently verified that?
They didn't have peer review at the time. That's another
exactly. So it's not like we don't have anything. The problem is that we don't have a lot that is completely certain. And we do know that a lot of those sources, as you rightly say, were written by conquerors, by people who probably had their own agendas. Maybe we're getting things secondhand. So, it's one of those things that you go into, and you have to ask good questions about your sources.
Yeah. And I see somebody in the chat mentioning Herodotus. Herodotus is also much better than Caesar. Definitely. as
Yeah.
a historical record. But again, as Emmy was saying, I think that it's important when we look at. I think we tend to look at ancient sources as, oh, this is an ancient source, it must contain the truth because it's much nearer to the beginning of times. But that is a story that you're telling yourself. It's not really what's happening. So it's important to take into account, of course, the historical records and what has been written, but it's equally important to ask yourself questions about reliability of those sources, whether they are consistent with other sources, and also whether there was a good historical record or whether it is a political manifesto, or I'm not saying that Caesar was writing a political manifesto, but he was known to say things in a certain way because he wanted to appear in a certain way to Rome. So he
Yeah.
was mainly a politician. That's for sure. So
Yeah.
I guess that sorry, gone.
Well, I was just going to say, this underlying sensibility in both paganism and the occult of believing that ancient peoples were closer to the source, or that they were inherently more magical, or that they had technologies that we didn't have, or that they were more somehow right. That's not something that I personally understand, and I would just, anybody who really believes that, just hang out with yourself. Ask yourself, why do you believe that? You may have a good answer, but for yourself, but that's just something that seems really, always has seemed bizarre to me. It's something that comes up all the time when I'm writing about particular figures, and because it's such a constant belief. And we see it, I think, a lot in the Reconstructionist, the Reconstructionist movement, is this idea that other people somehow knew better. And I don't know. I just ask you, if that's something you're into, just ask yourself why.
It's probably the myth of the golden age,
Yes.
and always seeking something that is other because the mundane is not interesting enough, and the sacred is by definition the other in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if I I think that is one tendency in paganism that is, I, I would like us to more critically explore that.
Yeah, I invite everybody to do so. So, Amy, where can people find you if they desire to do so?
Well, it would be lovely if people wanted to find
I
where I
encourage
am.
them to.
So you can find me pretty much everywhere at Amy Hale 93. By the way, I'm not an active Thelemite, but a lot
Yeah,
of
I
people.
was about to ask why 93.
Yeah, that's a whole complicated story. Um, but at one point I was more thelemically inclined than I am now. I'll say that. But 93 still stands for some. There's some good numerology in there, so I'm sticking with it. Also, it's just where I am now on the internet. So I'm Amy Hale 93 at Instagram, at Twitter, formerly known as Twitter. I have a Medium site, which is also Amy Hale 93, and I have my website, which is amyhale.me. You can find me there. And I'm also Amy Hale 93 at Gmail.
Thank you.
So if anybody wants to follow me there and continue the conversation, I am happy to do so.
Yes, absolutely. And you guys find all of these links in the info box, as long as YouTube allows links, clickable links, because they're gonna go soon apparently. So thank you so much, Amy. Thank you for being here. It was a super interesting conversation.
Oh, thanks so much. I hope I hope I answered everything in a suitable fashion. And thank you so much for inviting me to be on today. I really enjoyed chatting with you, and nice to hear from your audience as well.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. And we will chat more after the show.
All right. Fantastic.
So thank you all so much for being here on the live stream and also for watching this afterwards if that is the case. And if you like this episode, don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, activate the notification bell because YouTube is naughty and won't always show you my my new releases in the feed. So make sure that you have that notification thing on and you will always be notified, and share this video around, and of course let me know in the comments what you thought about it. I hope that it wasn't too disappointing. Unfortunately, it seems like academic knowledge and scholarship tends to um, highlight that certain narratives and mythologies are indeed narratives and mythologies. But I hope that you stick around because there's going to be a lot of academic fun coming up next. And thank you all for being here. And thank you to Andrew, Edward, and Joao for moderating the chat. Bye all for now.